What is the difference between polyurethane and acrylic polyurethane?
The difference between polyurethanes and acrylics. So they're both sort of in a way polyurethanes. They come, they're two component products, and they have a part A, which is the resin. And there are two different main groups and simplified groups of resins in these coatings. One is alkylic resin, which will have a higher solids and build. It's more versatile, meaning it's used in more applications and different formulations. It's lower quality and cost compared to the other, which is the acrylic resin. And the alkylic resin will also be slightly yellowish in color. Then we have another one, which is acrylic resin. It's a water white, high clarity, typically lower in solids and build, and it has an increased cost. So those are the two different part A's.
Yep.
And let's see, why am I not able to click this? Okay. And then we have two different main groups for it. Obviously this is simplified. Two different groups of part B, which is the isocyanate resin. So we have the aromatic isocyanate, which will yellow over time. It tends to cure a little bit faster. It has less flexibility compared to the other one, and it's a lower cost. Then the second one is aliphatic isocyanate. So it's a non-yellowing, slower curing, high flexibility. It can be formulated with outstanding hardness, and obviously it's a higher cost. So now that we know that we have two different part A's and two different part B's or main groups, when we look at acrylic polyurethanes, it is always an acrylic resin, and it is always an aliphatic isocyanate that will give you a water white, non-yellowing, high clarity, slightly slower curing, high flexibility, but lower in solids, good hardness, and the cost is higher in acrylics. Um, then when we look at polyurethanes, uh, it's always an alkylic resin that has high solids, slightly yellowish in color. And then part B can be varied. Typically for polyurethanes, there's a range of different catalysts that can be used that can be sort of tailored to make the part A perform in a certain way. And it's typically some kind of a mixture of aromatic isocyanate with aliphatic isocyanate with ratios varying. So there are some catalysts that will continue the product yellowing. They will have maybe less flexibility or cure faster or have more solids, and then vary in cost. And then there are catalysts that will offer a non-yellowing or resist to yellowing properties and maybe increase the hardness, increase the flexibility. It kind of depends on the mixture of these two isocyanate groups in the catalyst. What does it really translate to is that two-component polyurethanes will typically be associated with high build finishes, full fill finishes. If you're doing walnut or if you're doing high gloss and you need that full fill, typically you will go with polyurethane. Um, but keep in mind that polyurethane will be slightly yellow in color, and depending on the catalyst that you use, can significantly yellow more over time, or it can just remain the way it is, but it's already, as I said, slightly yellowish in color. Um, then when we look at acrylics, acrylics will be a low build finish typically most of the time, that will have a water white non-yellowing property. So, it really allows the wood to be as natural as possible with solvent-based coating. And it allows for typically in acrylic finishes, we will see the open grain, the open pore being sort of the main focus. So we see more increase of acrylic polyurethanes being popular because of the natural look, because of the open grain or wire brushed grain. The contemporary trends you'll see like whitewash stains on European or white oak. I call it high texture, low sheen type of finishes.
Yep.
Um, they're also more flexible, and also, when we go back to polyurethanes, if you're putting it on instruments or if you're putting it on antique furniture or something more of a traditional design or something that has an exotic wood, the polyurethanes typically will bring out that warmth and richness in the wood and the finish, where acrylic urethane will remain sort of cool and more true to the wood itself. So we also see a lot of applications on like these man-made recon veneers, the Arctic, whatever name manufacturer will assign to it, or bleached looks. That's when we will see acrylics, because they will retain that look, and they will typically, they will not yellow over time. And a lot of times these acrylic urethanes will also have UV inhibitor built into it, where it protects the substrate itself from yellowing further.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, is there more? Um, and the other, I think, important point to make is that in the past, and still till this day, a lot of people don't make the distinction and will use improper products on improper subs, or on a certain substrate. So if you use a high build polyurethane on an open grain wood, but you're not really going for the full fill look. You're just doing a seal coat on top coat. You will typically
Yeah.
have bridging, as you see on the left picture, of the grain, that it looks sort of filled, but as it's curing and evaporating solvents, it pops these little pinholes. So the grain doesn't really look that attractive. Where in the right picture, if you're going for that open grain look, you will use an acrylic that lays tightly down to the grain and really, highlights the structure of the open pore grain. So I would
Beautiful.
say that's the main difference, the difference to really understand about these two different coatings. Um,
Oh my God, it's so much clearer now, you know. Um, and would you say that one is more resistant than the other?
Typically, acrylics will be much more flexible than polyurethane. Polyurethane already is a highly flexible product. It's significantly more flexible than conversion varnish or pre-catalyzed lacquer. But
Right.
acrylic takes it even further. Um, Moisture resistance, because of its flexibility, acrylic might be slightly edging over polyurethane. Um, Chemical resistance is similar. Um, Surface hardness will actually vary. For example, Milesi, when I used to work on Milesi, we formulated our polyurethanes to have a better, a higher surface hardness than acrylics. Acrylics were more softer. Where my current company, Sivam Coatings, will um, our acrylics are actually formulated in a way where they cure to have a higher surface hardness than the polyurethane. So
Okay, I
so
see.
it
I
kind
see.
of so it kind of depends on the manufacturer and the formulation itself. But
Right, right.
definitely acrylic will be the water white, non-yellowing, high clarity, lower build in most cases, and highly flexible product.
Right, yeah, because I guess acrylic will be used, for example, if I stain the top of a guitar and I want to really keep that color that I achieved non-altered, I will have to use acrylic, yeah,
Yes,
for it to not go a little bit brownish or like
correct.
pop more the color. Okay, that
Correct.
that was amazing. Now it's so much clearer right now. Thank you very much. Can you apply polyurethane or polyester over nitrocellulose lacquer?
So I actually did some thinking on this. And I've known of cases and situations where people would spray various products over nitrocellulose lacquer, kind of treating nitrocellulose lacquer as that sort of I don't want to say neutral, but That's the only word that comes to mind, type of coating. And I think that might have been the case years ago, but I know that probably about 10 years ago, I was working with a furniture manufacturer in Chicago, and they have they have for years perfected these finishes where they would apply, 15, 20 coats of nitrocellulose lacquer, and they would have different glazes and washes in between these coats, really building the depth and very unique finish. They have told me at the time that most of the NC lacquers were reformulated due to some regulations, and now they cannot do it, and they switched to polyurethanes. Having said
Hmm.
that, I think it's important to note that I would not recommend spraying polyester over any coating. Polyester is just so hard and rigid that it will most likely have some kind of wrinkling or adhesion issue, or incompatibility, chemical incompatibility with the product underneath. Uh, from what I know, it is not recommended to really now to spray polyurethanes or any other coating over nitrocellulose lacquer because NC is very soft and it's flexible, but because it's so soft, anytime that you spray a harder coating over it, it can wrinkle, it can have adhesion problems. And there are certain sealers that the ingredients that they're formulated with can affect the NC lacquer adversely. There are certain solvents in coatings that can be too aggressive for a nitrocellulose lacquer, which really doesn't have any protection against these aggressive solvents, and it can cause removal, basically remelting of the NC lacquer and changing its uh, uh, lack of words today.
Of course.
It's it's structural integrity. Integrity is the word that I was
Right.
looking for. Um, there is also a thing where nitrocellulose lacquers can at times entrap um, moisture, and that can cause issues with solvents either evaporating from the coatings underneath or adjust or the coatings that are applied over them. The moisture entrapped in NC can affect the coating over it. But if you had to use nitrocellulose, I would say that it is safer to spray nitrocellulose over polyester or polyurethane or over anything else than the other way around. So the general rule, and of course there are always exceptions to all rules. There is probably some kind of a combination and formulation of product that you could do it, but in general terms speaking, I would say that you always want to have the harder coating on the bottom and softer on top, because anytime you have something softer underneath, when you apply coating that's harder and it tightens and solvents evaporate and the cross-linking happens, it can pull the coating on underneath, and it can pretty much wrinkle or crackle or do one of these things and
Ooh.
affect the integrity of the entire system. So, in regards to instruments, as much as I know about instruments, which isn't a lot probably compared to you, but I know that traditionally NC lacquers were the way to go. But because of the ease of fixing the coding itself, the ease of sort of remelting it and being able to fix it easily. But then we have coatings such as polyester or polyurethanes, which have high build and can really allow you to, you know, skip a lot of steps and basically save material time and labor, which equals cost. So I know that there are cases where they will, let's say, finish them with polyester, build up the finish, but the last coat or few coats will be nitrocellulose lacquer for ease of fixing any kind of scratches or dings or anything like that. Typically with polyester, applying polyester over anything, we have to use an isolante sealer because polyester itself has a difficulty adhering to wood substrate or even MDF itself. So typically what we will do is we'll have an isolante sealer applied first, which promotes adhesion, allows the system to have more wetting and grab onto the substrate, and then we apply polyester over it. or even
Oh,
the compatibility of pigments with polyesters. You know, if we're talking about using a pigmented solid color polyester, we can't just use any pigments. We can't just use, 844s or even polyurethane grade pigments in polyesters. Polyesters have their own group or of pigments that are specific to polyester.
can you spray polyurethane or polyester top coat over a base coat that is still open in order to achieve chemical bond?
I think that's defined by the technology and the formulation.
Okay,
So,
okay.
for example, when you look at coatings, nitrocellulose lacquer, and which I really actually don't have that much experience because by the time I was entering this business, in the sector that I was in, which was cabinetry and furniture, nitrocellulose lacquers were sort of phased out already because of the lack of durability. But from what I know about it, is that it's it doesn't have any cross-linking or catalyst, so it
Right,
cures by evaporating the solvents in it and pretty much air drying. So with nitrocellulose lacquer, you have that ability of the next coat because of the solvent, and it's sort of uh, um, melting into the previous coat.
right.
Um, I don't know if there's a certain time frame that you have to do it at. I'm assuming that if you do it within a day or certain hours, that it's probably a better choice than having something that's cured and then trying to spray it without any kind of abrading it by scuff sanding.
Right.
When we're talking about pre-catalyzed lacquers, there is a mechanical adhesion um, and some chemical adhesion, but you can't rely only on chemical in those products. When you go into conversion varnish, that no, mechanical is the only one. You
Hmm.
shouldn't be spraying wet on wet coats, which, by the way, is very common. There are plenty of shops and end users that will actually do it improperly, and they will do these wet on wet coats, but this is not correct. Now, when you're looking at water-based, when you're looking at polyurethanes or acrylic polyurethanes or even polyester, you can do wet on wet coats, but there is a time frame. And typically, obviously, or vary slightly on based on formulation and the manufacturer, but I would say between 1 hour after your previous coat was sprayed up to 3 hours is that window where you can spray another wet coat without scuff sanding the surface. Of course, humidity, temperature, air movement will play into it. The formulation, the type of solvent you use, or reducer will affect that slightly. Um, Anytime you will go from one component water-based to two component water-based, that becomes a little bit iffy and questionable, and maybe that time frame shrinks a little bit. But one of the main advantages of polyurethanes and acrylics when we go out there and promote these products is that if you're doing some kind of a pigmented finish and you need a lot of build, you can actually build wet and wet. So if you're applying two primers, you don't have to do primer, primer, sand, top coat. You can do primer, sand, top coat. Or when
Right.
we do, yeah, or when we do high
Yeah.
gloss finishes, typically one coat of high gloss finish is not enough because then when you're wet sanding and polishing, you'll get halos and burn throughs. So typically you apply wet on wet coats, thinner, well diluted with slower solvent. So in those cases, we'll apply wet on wet coats, two, or I prefer even myself three. So it gives you enough build to accommodate for your wet sanding and trying to polish that surface without any issues. Um, so
Yeah. The term wet is not necessarily like literally you see it's wet, but it's not cured, right?
it's not cured. And and
Right.
I,
Right.
and I know that one of the other questions you had somewhere in there is, how do you determine that? So, number one, always look at the TDS. The TDS, if it's possible, it will state that at this temperature and this humidity, you have this time frame where you can recoat without, wet on wet, which typically, like I said, it will be between 1 to 3 or 4 hours, depending on the manufacturer. But a good indicator is also when you can take your finger and press into the coating. You can handle the coating first of all,
Yep.
so it's dry to touch, but you can still imprint your fingerprint into the surface. It's probably a good time to apply the next coat. Now, in the high gloss application, that changes slightly because if you're doing wet on wet coats, typically we will dilute it with slower solvents to allow the gloss to really lay down and to allow us to spray less of the product and still allow it to flow so we don't have the surface irregularities later associated with heavy coats. Uh,
Yep.
with each consecutive coat, you sort of use either more slower solvent or you use more slower solvent because you're trying to avoid entrapment of air entrapment from evaporation from the previous coat. And high gloss coatings are really susceptible to any kind of issues like that.
Oh my God, I made that stupid mistake following an advice that I saw online. I don't know why I did it, which I sprayed the top coat on top of the urethane based color like 5 minutes after applying the color, and I got solvent pop all over the place. It was
Yeah,
horrible.
yeah, with that you'll have to really, normally I say, 1 hour is minimum, but when we do that, I say like 1.5 hour, and then the next coat maybe even longer if you're applying a third coat, depending on how slow the solvents are and retarders in the top coat.
Right, right, right.
And sometimes you won't even see the solvent pop till the next day. It might look great when you're leaving the shop and it's a few hours
Uh-huh.
after, and you come in the next morning and all of a sudden you look and there's, it's everywhere.
Oh my God, yeah, that happened to me for sure.
How does a coating adhere to a surface?
So there are two different for wood coatings, because different coatings, for metal and different substrates will have an additional ways of adhering. But for wood, we will have mechanical adhesion, um, and actually, what, I took some notes on this here. Let me. Okay, so mechanical adhesion, which is physical interlocking of the coating that flows into all the irregularities of the wood itself. So it's kind of like, when you abrade a surface to, let's say, stick something to it. If you go to a dentist and they're putting a filling, they will typically abrade the surface of the tooth a little bit so the filling bonds a little bit, interlocks almost like a key into the surface.
Yep.
Um, and so, the coating will penetrate in the grooves and pores and all that stuff. And chemical adhesion, um, which is typically more in wood coatings, it relates to inner coat adhesion, so a molecular bond between the sealer and top coat. When it comes to the wood, in wood applications, it's not really that
Yep.
significant. But something to sort of keep in mind is that um, is the wetting ability of the coating. Wetting means is how well the liquid can is distributes itself over the surface on a microscopic level. So the viscosity will play a role. If it's highly viscous, it won't really, seep into all the little nooks and crannies on a microscopic level. It will have a more difficult of a time of doing so, and how well, it deals with surface tension, so how well it flows on the surface. Um,
Hmm.
and that relates also to something called capillary action of the coating. So its ability again to flow into these narrow spaces and irregularities, where without being a physicist or a chemist, um, there is adhesive and cohesive forces that affect the surface tension. So uh, let's
Okay.
say there are certain coatings like the isolante sealers that will have a better wetting ability. That means that they have an easier ability to really grab onto the little, irregularities in the surface and will flow very well into it. Um, and then, also A lot of times, what I will suggest, if let's say there's some question about the stain use, maybe it's heavily pigmented, or maybe the wood is oily, or maybe for some reason maybe it's a high density wood, or there's some question or concern about adhesion. I will typically say, if you don't have isolante sealer, if you do, either way, increase the amount of solvent of the reducer that you're using, so you're basically thinning the material, allowing to have less viscosity and more of a capillary ability to have the wetting of the surface, which is important. So I think those are important points to understand.
Yep.
There is some cross-linking and curing that happens in certain coatings, that when they flow into these pores and stuff, that will strengthen the bond once it cures with the wood on some molecular level. But important point to make is that wood is hygroscopic. So, you need to abrade it. So you're sanding it to provide, you etch it to create, to enhance that irregularity and roughness of the surface. But actually, wood and coatings alike will absorb moisture from its surrounding, trying to reach moisture equilibrium with its surroundings. So it will always absorb moisture, and as it does, it will swell, meaning that the scratches that you made by sanding will shrink, right? So if, let's say, you sand something today with 150 grit, next week it might actually be more like 220. So uh, uh,
Wow.
important point to make is that you should do your sanding the same day that you're starting to finish. Or if it's not a possibility, if it's a large production and you have an enormous project where most of the sanding is done, throughout the weeks, as it goes to the finishing department and you're about to start finishing, it's good to give it one more sort of refresh, kind of quick sand to reopen that
Ooh.
grain to promote the adhesion.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, and so yeah, because sometimes I leave guitars sanded like for a week, and then I start painting. So that's no good. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks, thank you, sir. Okay, so you already have answered a couple of these. Like for example, are there coatings that are not compatible with each other? I think you mentioned that like polyester shouldn't be mixed with like other stuff. Uh,
Polyester shouldn't be sprayed on other stuff. You can spray stuff over polyester.
right,
Solvent-based coatings over polyester with proper sanding will should do okay. Water-based coatings over solvent-based coatings might have a hard time adhering. So it is important to have a proper cap standing schedule and do it right before application of water-based. It's kind of risky, so it's a possibility, but for your everyday average user, I would advise against it. Obviously, oil and water doesn't mix. So
right.
applying water, the popularity of these like oils such as rubium monocoat or some other stuff. People are just, though those finishes are meant to be a standalone finish.
Uh-huh.
But a lot of people like the look, but now they feel like, the oil is not strong enough, so now I'm going to coat it. Spraying solvent-based coating over that is already not good. Applying water over that is just catastrophic.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah, and actually for guitars it's a little bit challenging because sometimes you make a guitar neck out of maple and rosewood, which is oily, and the other one is not oily. So you have to seal the whole neck with something that it's ideal for oily stuff. So isolante, right? Uh,
although
yeah.
isolantes tend to maybe be, in a lot of cases, are slightly yellow in color. There are non-yellow water white isolantes, but they're very rare here in North America.
Right.
Very few companies will bring them in. So another solution could be possibly some kind of a vinyl sealer.
Right. Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, because one of my concerns, because I have seen it in a lot of guitars, is that some sealers that you use, they shrink over time, and then you start seeing this texture. I have
All sealers will shrink. All
E-
coatings
e-
will actually shrink.
even polyester?
Even polyester, so let me just make this point first, is that isolante sealer or vinyl sealers, their function is not to fill. Their function is to isolate and promote adhesion. So spraying isolante or vinyl sealer at a heavy coat is not ideal. You're just doing a light coat just to lock things in. Um, and then on top of that, you will use a different product to have your build. So keep that in
Mm,
mind. Now, all coatings will, well, 100% solid UV will not shrink because it's 100% solids, but all coatings will shrink dependent on the amount of solids or build that they have, right? So,
yeah.
um, like if you look at nitrocellulose lacquers, actually I don't know what the solid content is, but let's say pre-catalyzed lacquers, but I'm pretty sure nitrocellulose lacquers have a pretty low solid content, but pre-catalyzed lacquers, let's say 20 to 30% solids, conversion varnish 30 to 40% solids, acrylic polyurethanes probably around the same, anywhere depending on the type of acrylic, you could have anywhere from 25% solids to 50% solids. Polyurethanes 40 to 70, and polyesters could go from 80 to 95.
Mm,
The amount of solids will determine how much it will shrink. So if you spray polyester that's 95% solids, that means that once it fully cures, 95% of your wet milk thickness will remain, only 5% of it will be gone. If you spray a pre-catalyzed lacquer at 30% solids, 70% of your wet coat will eventually evaporate and the coating will shrink. And most of the shrinking is done, in the first 24 hours whenever the product cures. Uh, but it really continues to happen over time for a very long time. So in high gloss finishes, a lot of people make a mistake where they will do some kind of full fill finish and they will build and then they will, spray high gloss and it looks great and flat, beautiful. They'll wait a day or two and wet sand and polish it and it's beautiful. And then a month later, they come back and all of a sudden it doesn't look as glossy because it has furtherly shrunk and now you have imperfections in some microscopic level on the surface that deflect the light in an improper way and lose the gloss. Or in cases of like, put doing a full high gloss finish on like let's say oak or mahogany or walnut or any kind of open wood where you're actually filling the grain, all of a sudden you see that the grain starts, sinking and you see that. So really, the higher build of the product you use, the less shrinking you will have, and proper cure time is really necessary, or unless you have some kind of forced curing abilities that will speed up that process and evaporate all the solvents that will allow you to do that.
yeah, like heat and stuff. Um, okay, so I think I feel good using polyester as a sealer because I see that it's very solid and doesn't shrink. But one hesitation that I have is that since polyester is very thick, right? If you want to seal an ash piece of wood, right?
Mhm.
Uh, would it be better to grain fill first and then polyester, or the polyester can like go into those little grains and it
It
should be
can
fine?
it can go into little grains. I personally don't like wood fillers. I associate it with more of a traditional or older approach. And typically there's some kind of linseed oil based, so it's not ideal. Um,
Yeah.
Polyester should be fine, although, remember, number one, actually, speaking of solid wood, polyester is very rigid. So if you have shrinking and expanding, if the substrate is not dimensionally stable, polyester is not ideal.
Yeah, that's a disadvantage. Yes. And actually,
Uh,
I have experienced delamination because of that.
There you go, and there will be cracking, delamination, and other things. But if we were going to fill in ash, we would use an isolante first, which is very thin. It will promote adhesion and will seep into those deep pores. And typically, my approach on filling in the deep grain wood, no matter what I'm using, is to dilute the first coat more, so it allows more. It increases the capillary ability of the coating to go into all those little nooks and crannies, and then the consecutive coats are regularly thinned or even less thin to build upon that. Um,
Ooh, right. Yeah, like a 10% reduction or something. Yeah.
you know, more actually,
More.
on polyesters like on seal coats or base coats, you'll see, recommendation depending on manufacturer 10-20%. I will do the first coat at 40%,
Oh, wow. Okay. Very thin. Yeah.
very thin, and then the consecutive coats at 10%, let's say.
Okay, okay, okay. And by the way, real quick, it's okay to spray polyester sealer over the isolante, right?
Yes, yes. So,
Okay.
and actually, there are two different ways of doing it. One way is that you spray the isolante, you allow it to cure properly according to the product data sheet, which typically will be like 4 or 6 hours. And then you lightly scuff sand and apply polyester. But whenever you do that, there is a possibility that when you're scuff sanding and you can't really see it, you will sand through certain areas without knowing it, and then you can have issues. So the best
Yep.
way of doing it is doing it wet and wet. So let's say you apply a isolante sealer, you wait an hour, and then directly onto that you apply polyester, well diluted polyester, and then you can keep building wet and wet. Uh,
Uh-huh.
uh, but that's an ideal solution there.
What are resins and where do they come from?
In general, the coatings are typically mixture of some kind of a petroleum-based resin that can include some organic, like linseed oil, or I actually have it written down here, so I wouldn't forget. But
Yep.
so linseed oil or soybean type of things that can uh, um, be used to manufacture these resins. But in general, it's petroleum or petrochemical nature. Uh, then you have nitrocellulose, which obviously is derived from cellulose, which comes from a plant-based type of material. Um, there is more of a movement today into biocoatings. And what that means a lot of times is that they're replacing the petroleum based with some kind of an organic or renewable organic type of compound that can be used for to manufacture these resins. But this is still in its infancy, and it's more for promotion and marketing rather than really implemented in the market, especially here in North America.
Right. Yeah. So basically, resins are the actual material that the finish is made of, and everything else is like carriers, solvents to
So
make it
if you
workable.
if you kind of simplify it, you have the resin, you have various additives that could be, to increase powdering on sanding with sealers, could be, matting agents and top coats, could be some kind of ceramic additives to increase surface visibility, to deflect scratches or marring or marking, so many other things, UV
Right.
inhibitors and so on and so forth, or wetting abilities or wetting agents. Um, and then there is I call it the vehicle, the solvent. Is it water? Is it solvent? Is it, some kind of linseed oil? It's basically what allows the coating to become liquid and be applied by brush, roller, flow coating, dipping, spraying, and then evaporates and allows the resin to sort of form the hard
Right.
film on the surface.
What is the difference between automotive polyurethanes and wood coating polyurethanes?
I was always under the impression that wood coatings would be more flexible because of the wood's ability to flex, and it does flex, and depending on moisture content and seasonal changes. But I actually looked that up, and I have found sort of conflicting information saying that uh, automotive polyurethanes should be flexible due to the movement of parts because of the movement of vehicles, right? So certain vibrations and movement, um, that they're more resistant to harsh chemicals which you can find outside or on the roads. They should be more impact resistant because of the debris and rocks and everything else like that. Uh, um, where on the other hand, wood coatings, urethanes will have a more of a wetting power. So the way that they sort of flow into the wood grain, but they still have to be flexible. Maybe not as hard in the surface itself, but in my opinion, that would make them more flexible than automotive coating. So maybe the way that they flex is in a slightly different manner, or vibration versus actual dimensional shrinking and expansion. Um,
Yeah, and also automotive, you have to spray so thin. It's like 5 mil max, and so if you wanna spray a piece of wood, you cannot like build. You have to like do multiple sessions, kind of thing. So
so I
yeah.
would think that because of that, that it would determine that they are less flexible.
Hmm.
Because if you look at, let's say, conversion varnish for precast lacquer, you're also limited to a certain mill that you can apply. Otherwise, the coating itself will start, it will become too rigid and it will crack on its own without any movement. Where with polyurethanes and
Right.
acrylics, you can really go much higher with the build that you apply.
Yep.
Um, so
Definitely.
that's sort of my take on it. I wouldn't say it's definitive or that I'm really the expert on what the difference is. I would it would be interesting to hear from somebody from the automotive industry.
Right.
Uh, um, you know,
Do you think a thick finish will affect the tone or dampen the sound on a guitar?
I think so. Had
Okay.
a conversation with a good friend of mine who's a luthier. His father started is the owner of I can't remember the name right now, but uh, 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 a large luthier manufacturer, so to speak, in Chicago. And we had this conversation years ago,
Yep.
uh, and then I did a little bit of a refreshing for myself um, to see if what I knew was correct. And I'm just looking at my notes right here.
Yep.
Let's see. So, I mean, just logically, it makes sense. If you're using the wood, I'm assuming, because I don't know, but in acoustic guitar or a violin type of instrument, I'm assuming that the wood has to be a certain thickness, and that will affect its natural vibration and the resonance associated with this wood. And then I'm assuming certain woods will have a different way of transmitting the sound waves. So
Yep.
if you have a coating that's very thick or rigid, that will limit that vibration and that tonal resonance of the instrument.
Right.
So I think in here you want a thinner coat and you do want a more flexibility
Right.
that it will sound better. So now I don't know if, like, let's say you're finishing violin, if you're finishing the interior of it, and let's say you use nitrocellulose lacquer, but I don't know if the thickness of the coating on the exterior of that type of instrument will play much role, but I would assume so because it still stiffens the wood.
Right.
But I think the differences will be minute because really, unless you're applying polyester and you're really building it thick, uh, uh, you know, one coat of polyurethane versus two coats of nitrocellulose, I think that there will be some difference, but it would be something that would have to be measured or experienced by experts.
Right.
But I
I
might be
agree.
wrong.
What are the best practices to avoid delamination?
You know, the lamination, yeah, we spoke about this a little bit. With
Yep.
coatings and wood, sanding the same day that the next finishing process step is. So if you're sanding wood before you apply sealer or stain, make sure you do it the same day or at least refresh it. Same goes with sealers and coatings. If you send a sealer today, but you don't spray a top coat on top of it until next week. Give it a refresher because it will also absorb moisture and uh, um, shrink these scratches that you have made by abrading the surface. And obviously, another point is to, make sure that the coatings are compatible, or if they're not, or if you're jumping from one technology to another, understand the differences. Polyester is very hard. It will be harder to adhere. That's something that's softer. Um,
Yep.
Water-based coatings will have a harder time adhering to solvent-based, but it's possible. Using heavily pigmented or heavily linseed oil type of stains can cause can create a sort of a barrier, sort of a greasy film over the surface of the wood that the sealer will have a hard time adhering to. Or if you're doing any kind of inner coat coloring, so any kind of toners or things like that, or glazing, and that always introduces just a little bit more of a probability of an issue. So make sure that you understand what you're putting in between, that it's compatible. We see a lot of people doing things such as, they will use a solvent-based wiping stain, which is some kind of it contains some kind of a linseed oil like mixture in there, and that will stain the wood. And let's say they will um, seal over that too fast, not allow those slow solvents to evaporate. And let's say maybe it has a lot of pigment in it, which creates an additional layer of resin and slows down the evaporation rate. If you
Right.
coated that too quickly, then it can cause adhesion issues. But then we'll see people later needing to tone something, so they sealed something. They'll take that same stain and put it in their finisher, dilute it, but wiping stain and that linseed oil or whatever might be in there is not meant to be in between the coats, so it can cause some issues. Denser woods versus softer woods will need more attention to sanding, maybe thinning out the seal coat a little bit more, maybe using an isolante sealer to promote that adhesion. Typically, it's a mixture of things. Like if we see the lamination from the wood, or a lot of times what we'll see is high density wood. So you'll have like hickory or oak or ash or even
Right.
maple.
Right.
And then on top of this was sanded with like some, let's say 180 grit. A week before, it was stained with a heavily pigmented dark stain, and then top coated an hour later with a polyurethane sealer. And then all of a sudden, yes, it's flaking off because you have
Ah,
all these things playing in together. So, that's the substrate itself with between intercoat adhesion, you know, try to stick to the same technology, the same types of products. If you're not, for some reason, if you're varying the technology, understand, what is underneath, what's on top, and what needs to happen for it to bond together. Um, I don't know if that makes sense.
right. That's a good one. Staying with the same technology, not trying to mix oil and other stuff. Right.
Yeah, yeah, and there are cases where we mix things for specific reasons and specific cycles.
Right.
But if you don't have to, don't.
Right. 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 By the way, what's the highest you will go when sanding a sealer? Like, can you go to up to like 1,000 grit?
I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay.
So so the general rule is, I would say, and 320 is kind of a good standard
Right. Right.
if you're sending a sealer. Uh,
Okay. Okay.
I personally always go up to 400 because I just find it easier to work with, and I know what needs to happen. So it's a slightly higher grid, but gives you a little bit more control, not sending through and things of that nature. You know, then you get into applications where you have high gloss and where it can telegraph the sanding scratches underneath. And this is where people sort of struggle because sending into 320 or 400 might be too aggressive. When you spray this very thin high gloss coating that's really susceptible to showing every imperfection and then shrinking, and then that high gloss will really reflect all the things that happen underneath, telegraphing the scratches. People will tend to step to a higher grit. So let's say we do it with a 600 grit. Um, Sure, that's okay, but be careful. Do it right before you apply the top coat.
Right.
It's sort of a balance. Um, then there are finishers that will go higher. That will go up to 800 or 1,000, but in my opinion, that's too far.
Yeah, I guess at some point you don't get that mechanical
Yeah,
bump, right? Right, right, right. Okay, okay, good to know.
What is the maximum grit we should sand bare wood to apply finish?
depending on the wood, you can go between 120 to 180. Oak, I would sand it with a lower grit. It's a higher density wood. If it was something softer like walnut, 150, 180, depending on how you wanted the stain to penetrate, because the sanding will also affect how much it pulls, how much you open that wood for to accept the stain. Uh, if you're using water-based stains, you can go up to 220. Water has a little bit more of a better ability to penetrate it. The wood has affinity for water, so it'll pull it in. And same goes with coatings. For solvent-based, never ever would I go higher than 180
Wow. Okay.
on the bare wood. And
So, so the higher the grit, the less saturated the
the
stain
less
will look.
adhes. Yeah, yeah. So you can make an experiment, send a same piece of wood with 100 grit, and take it to an extreme, and another, and the same piece of wood with 320, and then use the same stain at the same time, and see what happens.
It,
Um,
right. Okay. Okay.
um,
Okay.
and then, so for solvent-based coatings, I would never go higher than 180 for just the coating itself. And again, that depends on the types of wood. So 150 is kind of a good, medium, middle of the road sort of approach. With water-based coatings, you can go a little bit higher. You can go up to 220, but I would never go higher than that.
What properties does a sealer have that make it ideal for sealing but not as a protective final coat?
So typically
Uh,
in the protective in the top coats, in specific top coats, you will see things like silica, which would not be good in a sealer because it would sort of compromise adhesion. So silica will allow the product to have a little bit more of a resistance uh, to scratching and tarnishing or burnishing.
mm,
Um, and it has more, the top coats will have a more chemical moisture resistance and surface hardness, where sealers have a little bit more of a wetting ability, so ability to grab onto the surface and flow into the little microscopic nooks and crannies. The sealers will have some kind of a filler for to make it easier to sand and level for the top coat to adhere to. um, That'd be
yep.
pretty much the general.
I'm glad to know this because there are some folks saying that, oh, you can seal the neck of the guitar and just leave it like that, just sand it smooth and that's it. And that sounds like such a bad idea because that's a high traffic surface. You touch
Yeah,
it all
yeah.
the time.
So
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 yeah.
you so you'll have products that will have, most products will have a specific sealer and base coat and top coat, but there are also some products that are self sealers, like especially in water based 1K products, and those products will a lot of times be sort of in the middle. They'll have good sanding, good wettability, and good surface resistance to
Okay.
things, but not the highest. So you can use the same product, as a top coat and as a sealer. Um, but good example is. Um, Using glazes. Long time ago, when I was a finisher, I would make these samples of different various looks with glaze, some kind of glaze, wet glaze or a dry glaze on it. And when I made the sample, it worked great. Then we were doing a project. It was not coming out. The glaze was biting into the surface way too much, and I couldn't remove it. And I just struggled with it. It didn't occur to me at the time that maybe when I made the sample, I used the top coat over sealer and then applied the glaze, and the top coat was more resistant, so the glaze didn't bite in as much, and it was easier to remove. And then all of a sudden we were doing a job, and like, why do we spray additional top coat underneath the glaze? So we would seal everything, then apply the glaze, and all of a sudden we can't remove it as well. It's because that sealer did not have the resistance and allowed the glaze to bite in too much, and it was harder to remove later. It stained easier, so to
Right.
speak.
There you go. That makes sense.
For high solids, thicker finishes like polyester, what spray gun do you recommend?
For polyester, I like using 2.2 tip. I like using those pressurized cups too. If you like using like a PPS system, with the little insert, there are ones that you have air that kind of pressurizes it and pushes it out.
Right.
Um, that's good. If for polyurethanes and water-based products, regular 1.8 tip, maybe for
Okay.
water-based 2 point, but urethanes do well 1.8 or 2.0, but 1.8 is kind of a middle of the road. Then when talking about pumps, it's actually been so long. I've been in a, actually finishing. I don't remember the sizes and the coding for the tips these days, but you probably wouldn't be spraying polyester out of a pump unless it was a specialized pump that would mix the components at the tip, because polyester has such a short pot life, right? Uh,
Yeah, like
so
10 minutes or something. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
What are the most common mistakes due to which a finish never hardens?
Well, I think, first of all, we got to consider the hardness of the coatings. Nitrocellulose being very soft. Then you got
Yeah.
pre-cut lacquer conversion varnish. Then you have polyurethane, acrylic, polyester, UV. So just the hardness of the technology or the chemistry itself is a determining factor. Then we have, sometimes even the substrate can affect. Like if we have like soft wood, like pine, and we have a coating that's can flex, you can impress the actual surface and you're pressing in the wood and the coating flexes with it. But if you have
Mm.
high density woods, which is what we mostly will use in various applications, I think it's the coating itself. So separate from the chemistry and the type of a coating and what its performances or characteristics are, um, what could cause it is some kind of compromise in the finishing system or the cycle. So let's say if the stain, as I mentioned before, maybe it's a heavy pigmented stain with some kind of a universal pigment like 844 that has a lot of resin that will leave a soft film on the surface, doesn't allow the sealer to really grab onto the wood. It can, from there, sort of soften the whole cycle. It can be that certain dyes or stains that don't have a proper binder in them to lock them onto the surface will bleed and compromise the integrity of the sealer, which then compromises the integrity of the top coat, make the whole system softer. Then you have improper catalyzation or cross-linking, depending on the application or usage. Maybe coats were applied too fast and there's still solvents of gassing and they're entrapped. And so it could be a range of things.
Right.
But I think the number one thing to consider is what kind of coating you're using.
Right.
Nitrocellulose will be soft. Polyurethane will be much harder. Conversion varnish is actually slightly harder and surface than polyurethane or acrylic, but it doesn't flex, so it doesn't really make it that durable because as the wood moves, it will crack.
Hmm.
So I think in the aspect of that, your best kind of um, a compromise is polyurethanes or acrylics because they have enough flexibility, but they're pretty hard. Polyester is much harder, but it's a specific application that, there's so many sort of, there's a bit of a complexity to using polyester from the application itself and mixing and preparing it to knowing what to use it over, like with certain stains and isolantes, or considering the dimensional stability of the substrate that you're applying it, being like, if you're doing solid wood, if you, let's say, if you had a table that was made out of multiple planks of solid wood, I would not be applying polyester because those will independently sort of shrink and expand, and then it will crack and delaminate. If we had a table that was made out of MDF core with a veneer over it, I would use polyester. Um,
Oh, I
so
see.
so I don't know if if I'm making an electric body guitar, polyester could work, I think. But if you're making a violin, maybe not. If you're making a piano, I'm assuming you could use MDF and you could use polyester over that. Um, so
So the scale of hardness, let's say roughly, would you say that it's nitro, then pre-cut lacquer, then polyurethane 2K, then acrylic,
conversion
then
varnish,
conversion varnish, then polyester, then UV
UV,
polyester. That's the hardest.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool, cool, cool. That's a good scale to to look at.
Why finishes found at Home Depot, for example, are not as durable as industrial wood coatings?
It's the phrasing and marketing sort of approach to the market. So, you know, polyurethanes, what is it really? It refers to polyurethanic reaction. Um, so you can have some kind of a polyurethane resin in like an oil-based finish and call it polyurethane, sell it to, to a hobbyist or a do-it-yourselfer at Home Depot, and you're using that term polyurethane or acrylic urethane to sort of capture this customer, and they perceive it as something more durable. In fact, those type of products have nothing to do with what the industrial professional use products are. If you're
Oh,
talking about, two-component polyurethane or two-component acrylic, solvent-based professional use types of products, those are products where you have the part A, the alkylic or aliphatic aromatic resin, and then you have the isocyanate part B, that will, when put together, will form some kind of a polyuretanic reaction and bond, and those products, once catalyzed, will have a certain pot life. So within, 2, 3, 4 hours, they will harden into a, a sort of a maybe rubbery or a harder resins
yep.
type of material, where the stuff you buy at, the store, it will cure by air. So there is no reaction, there's no cross-linking at and then sort of an aggressive in a chemical way. So the more aggressive or the more active chemistry is, the more durable the product will be. And obviously, nobody's going to be selling, something at Home Depot or some kind of paint store that you maybe outside of like an epoxy resin where you add the part B and the hardness, because it would just wouldn't be viable for somebody working in their garage. Um,
Yeah, because all of those things are 1K always, right? So generally speaking, 1Ks are not as durable as a 2K, right? Generally
yes,
speaking,
yes, that
never,
that is
never.
that is absolutely correct. Um, yeah, 100%.
Right.
Like I said, the more active the chemistry and the cross-linking the reaction is, the harder, the more durable the product is. So, polyester, you have 10 minutes to use. Yeah, the product is really hard. Maybe it's not
Yeah.
flexible. That's just functionality of it. But, polyurethanes and acrylics and conversion varnish, they all receive a certain catalyst that will either kick off the reaction or become part of the coating and start cross-linking. The water-based 2K products will have a hardener that strengthens the cross-linking as the product is curing. Um,
Yep.
so yeah.
Cool, cool, cool. Well, I think that's all, man. I really appreciate your time. I have been kind of a fan of yours because you explain things really well. I watched both of your videos with Eric, so thank you very much for that.
Oh, my pleasure.